So I think I told you about the spheres, didn't I, that started this whole thing off with the raised text. And those developed into the pebbles because a pebble is the kind of thing that you pick up when you're out for a walk and you take home. You always remember where it was, and having the poetry around it with the raised text gives it more to the story, I think, of where it's come from. So that's where those things developed into. But in parallel to that, I was also working with the extruded script. And initially, I was using earthenware, and I was making some quite big pieces, which were flat script, but a bit, not quite illegible, but a bit wavy, a bit like waves on the shore. And the backgrounds I painted in acrylic inks so that they had the colours of the landscapes that inspired them. And I think initially I was using my own stories and some of my own words or poetry that inspired me. And then I started to do some residencies, like at Mottisfont, or I interviewed some refugees about the places that they'd come from and places from home that they really remembered. And I switched to working in porcelain because that allowed me to use a much finer script, and it was a bit more legible as well. So pieces like this are smaller, but they're more fine, legible pieces of script. And I think working with those refugee tales made me think about stories that travel. And I wanted to take the words off the page and to come up with the idea of the story travels with us. We take all our stories with us wherever we go, like coracles. So that's where these shapes came from.
It's lovely.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's that idea of you can hold it in your hand and you hold it
Your
again.
ideas in your hand.
Yeah. So again,
That's
like the pebbles, it's something you hold in your hand that's very
Lovely.
precious to you and has a memory.
Mm.
So that's where I was working probably last year. And then I think because I like the idea of the landscape and the links, I want to develop pieces that can go back into the landscape and be shown back on the beach, or
So where the story first came from.
Yeah, where the story came from. Now that I can't do in porcelain, so what I'm doing is playing around with different formulations of clay to come up with something that's robust enough to go outside, but also that's robust enough to form a shape.
And the porcelain would be too difficult to work with.
Yeah.
Was that why you're not doing that? Because
Yeah.
in the bigger size it would just be too
it-
difficult.
It's floppy, isn't it? When you fire it, these kind of shapes would need to be supported,
Yes.
and in porcelain. And I have this thing in my mind about going back to the sphere, but in a different way. So to actually create a whole sphere that's just words.
That'd be amazing.
Now I'm nearly there, not quite. So here's some of the pieces that I've got to so far. But I've had to completely change the clay mix, and I haven't quite got there yet. But that's what I'm working on now.
Do you aim to make them a bit larger?
Oh yes.
How big? How big?
How big? Ooh, about that
Really?
size. I
Gosh.
think so.
Yeah.
It'd be wonderful to see a whole row of
Yeah.
those somewhere, wouldn't
Yeah.
Yeah, it's graded. Look.
it?
Now,
So how are you going to make a sphere? Do you actually have a mould, or how are you going to do that then without, well,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
without it collapsing or...
yeah. Well, I need a mould that I can write over, but that allows the clay to shrink, and that also will then burn away in the kiln. So I'm playing around with very thin papier-mâché, or I mean, some people use balloons. I'm not quite sure about that. I haven't tried that yet, but yeah, that's the technical challenge, which quite appeals to me as well. Anyway, yeah, I do like experimenting. Yeah.
So you'll probably have a more than 50% rate of on that one.
Yeah, probably. Yes. But that's what's fun about it, isn't it? It's taking an idea and then saying, how can I actually deliver that idea.
Mm.
I think that's what interests me.
And what writing will be on that then? Because obviously you've got the stories of the refugees, and there you've got poetry, and here there's a where you found them type of script. What are you going to write on those then?
I think it will be back to poetry about the landscape that it comes from. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where we spiral, isn't it? So you go back to an original idea, but not in the same way. It then evolves into something else.
Mm.
Interesting. So it's sort of come full circle, but not, because it's different. So
yeah.
fascinating.
Mm.